The hardest lessons in love are never taught by the people who stay. They're taught by the ones who leave. I used to tell my students that every great novel began with a question worth answering, but standing outside the county courthouse on a gray October afternoon, I realized my own life had become a story without a single page I wanted to read. The divorce papers rested inside my leather tote, heavier than they had any right to be, while a cool breeze carried the scent of rain across the parking lot. For 16 years, I had introduced myself as Evelyn Carter, wife, teacher, dependable woman who always knew the next chapter before anyone else did. Now I wasn't sure who I was supposed to become. My phone buzzed before I reached my car. It was my sister, Hannah. "How are you holding up?" she asked. I looked through the windshield at the rows of maple trees already turning shades of amber and crimson. "I think I'm still waiting for someone to tell me this is all part of the lesson," I answered quietly. She laughed with the kind of kindness only family can manage. "Maybe it is." After we hung up, I drove home through familiar streets that suddenly felt borrowed. Every coffee shop, every bookstore, every stoplight reminded me of routines that no longer belonged to me. My house greeted me with silence, so complete I could hear the ticking kitchen clock from the front hallway. I placed the signed documents inside a drawer without looking at them again. They had already taken enough from me. Monday morning arrived with the dependable rhythm of school bells and hallway chatter. Teaching had always been my refuge, the one place where I knew exactly what to say. Yet when I stood before 30 juniors discussing symbolism in classic American literature, my voice felt strangely distant, as though another woman had borrowed it for the day. Near the end of class, one of my students asked whether people could really change after making the wrong choices. I paused longer than usual before answering. "Sometimes," I said, "the biggest changes happen after we admit we don't know everything." The room grew unexpectedly quiet. Even I wasn't sure whether I was speaking to them or to myself. During lunch, the principal invited me into her office. She smiled in the encouraging way administrators often do before assigning extra work. "Evelyn, we're partnering with the City Arts Council for a community education project this semester. We'd love for you to co-lead it." I almost declined before she finished the sentence. I had no energy left for committees, presentations, or smiling through introductions with strangers. Then she added one more detail. "You'll be working with a guest instructor named Claire Morgan. She's one of the most creative educators we've ever invited." I nodded politely, unaware that those few ordinary words had just opened the first page of a story I never could have planned, and perhaps the first lesson my heart was finally ready to learn. The following Thursday arrived with a steady drizzle that painted the school windows in soft gray streaks, and I spent most of the morning convincing myself that the community project would simply be another professional obligation. I carried a notebook, 2 sharpened pencils, and the same quiet determination I brought into every classroom, hoping preparation could disguise uncertainty. The meeting was scheduled in the old art studio, a space I had not visited in years. The scent of fresh paint and brewed coffee lingered in the air before I even reached the doorway. Colorful student canvases leaned against the walls, each one unfinished, each one somehow more hopeful than I felt. I stepped inside expecting introductions, handshakes, and polite conversation. Instead, I found a woman standing on a ladder, carefully hanging a large watercolor landscape above the presentation board. She climbed down with effortless balance, brushed a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear, and smiled as though we had already met somewhere pleasant. "You must be Evelyn," she said. "I am Claire Morgan." Her voice carried warmth without trying too hard, the kind that made people naturally listen. I returned the smile, though mine felt slightly out of practice. "Nice to meet you." She extended her hand, and when our palms met, her grip was confident but gentle, the sort of greeting that suggested partnership instead of formality. "I have heard wonderful things about your students," she said. "Apparently, they actually enjoy reading." I laughed before I realized I was laughing. "Some days they pretend very well." She grinned. "That counts." We spent the next hour reviewing lesson ideas for the community program. I expected an artist who cared only about creativity, but Claire surprised me by speaking passionately about discipline, structure, and helping people discover confidence through small victories. She wanted every participant, regardless of age, to create something meaningful. I found myself disagreeing with several of her ideas, particularly her plan to begin the first workshop without lectures or instructions. People usually need guidance before freedom, I told her. She tilted her head thoughtfully instead of arguing. Or maybe they need permission to stop worrying about being perfect. Her answer lingered with me longer than I cared to admit. After the meeting ended, most of the staff hurried back to their classrooms, but Claire remained behind, adjusting brushes and organizing supplies with patient precision. I gathered my notebook and thanked her for the discussion. "You know," she called as I reached the door, "I think your students are lucky." I turned back. "Why?" "Because you listen before you speak. Not every teacher remembers how important that is." The compliment caught me completely off guard. I had spent months feeling invisible, convinced the best parts of me had quietly disappeared somewhere inside a failed marriage. Yet here was someone who had known me for less than 90 minutes and noticed something I had forgotten about myself. Walking back through the hallway, I realized I was no longer paying attention to the rain outside. Instead, I kept replaying one simple sentence in my mind. Maybe people really did need permission to stop chasing perfection. Maybe I did too. I had entered that room expecting another assignment on my already crowded schedule. I left carrying something far less tangible and far more unsettling: curiosity about the woman whose optimism felt strangely impossible to ignore. The first workshop planning session was scheduled for the following Tuesday afternoon, and by the time my last class ended, I had already convinced myself that keeping things professional would be easy. I arrived 10 minutes early carrying a folder filled with lesson plans, discussion prompts, and carefully organized notes. Claire was already there, sitting cross-legged on one of the large tables instead of a chair, sketching absent-mindedly in a weathered notebook while soft instrumental music drifted from a portable speaker near the window. She looked up the moment I walked in and smiled as though seeing me was the best part of her day. "You are early," she said. "Teachers are supposed to be," I replied, placing my folder on the table. "Artists usually arrive whenever inspiration decides to show up." She laughed. "That stereotype is unfair. I was actually here 20 minutes ago." I raised an eyebrow. "Trying to prove a point already?" "Absolutely." Her easy confidence should have annoyed me, yet somehow it only made the room feel lighter. We spread our materials across the long table and compared ideas. My outline included reading excerpts from classic American novels before encouraging participants to write reflections. Claire studied the pages carefully before sliding them back toward me. "It is thoughtful," she said. "But what if they are afraid to write because they think there is a right answer?" I folded my arms. People usually feel safer when they understand expectations. She picked up a blank sheet of watercolor paper and placed it between us. And sometimes they discover something beautiful because nobody told them what they were supposed to create. We stared at each other for a second, neither of us speaking. Then, unexpectedly, we both laughed at exactly the same moment. The tension dissolved as quickly as it had appeared. "Maybe we are both stubborn," I admitted. "Maybe that is why this project might actually work," she answered. The afternoon slipped by faster than either of us expected. We rearranged tables, sorted paintbrushes, tested presentation equipment, and debated everything from lighting to background music. At one point, I reached for a box of colored pencils just as Claire did. Our fingers brushed for the briefest instant before we both instinctively pulled back. "Sorry," we said together, followed by another shared laugh that echoed through the nearly empty studio. It was such an ordinary moment, yet it stayed with me long after it passed. As the daylight faded beyond the windows, golden light spilled across the wooden floor and filled the room with the quiet warmth that only late autumn afternoons seem able to create. Claire stepped back to examine the layout we had built together. "You know," she said softly, "I think people remember how a room makes them feel long before they remember what was taught inside it." I looked around at the colorful supplies, the welcoming chairs arranged in a circle instead of straight rows, and the empty canvases waiting for strangers to fill them with pieces of themselves. I always believed learning started with information, I said. Maybe it starts with feeling safe, Claire replied. Driving home that evening, I realized something had shifted inside me without permission. For the first time in months, I was thinking about tomorrow instead of yesterday. I caught myself wondering what unexpected idea Claire might bring to our next meeting, what impossible question she might ask, and why every conversation with her somehow left me seeing the world from a slightly different angle than before. The first community workshop arrived on a bright Saturday morning wrapped in crisp autumn air, and I stood outside the school auditorium, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Families, retirees, college students, and curious neighbors filtered through the front doors carrying quiet conversations and uncertain smiles. I watched them hesitate before entering, recognizing the same nervous expression I had seen on countless students during the first day of class. Claire walked across the parking lot balancing two oversized boxes filled with art supplies, somehow making the awkward load look effortless. She smiled the moment she spotted me. "Good morning, Professor Prepared," she teased. "Please tell me you remembered the name tags." I lifted a small plastic container from my tote bag. "Alphabetize," she laughed. I had no doubt. Together we transformed the empty auditorium into a welcoming, creative space. She arranged easels in loose circles while I placed notebooks and pencils on every table. We worked without needing many words, naturally filling the gaps in each other's routine. Whenever I finished one task, Claire had already anticipated the next. It felt surprisingly comfortable, as though we had been collaborating for years instead of weeks. Just before the doors officially opened, she stood in the center of the room and slowly turned in a circle, studying every detail. "It still needs something," she whispered. I looked around. Everything appeared organized. "What is missing?" She walked to a nearby shelf, picked up a small glass vase, and filled it with bright yellow sunflowers that had been delivered for another school event. She placed them near the entrance. Suddenly, the entire room felt warmer. "People notice little things," she said quietly. "Sometimes they decide whether they belong somewhere within the first 10 seconds. I found myself nodding before I realized it. The workshop began with hesitant introductions. I welcomed everyone and explained that stories had always helped people understand themselves. Then Claire surprised me by asking everyone to draw the place where they felt most at peace before writing a single word. Several participants looked uncertain, but within minutes laughter replaced silence as colored pencils moved across paper. I walked between the tables expecting to answer questions, yet most people were already deeply engaged. Claire caught my eye from across the room and offered a small smile that seemed to say, "Trust them." For once, I did. During the lunch break, we escaped outside to the courtyard where orange leaves drifted across the brick walkway. I admitted something I rarely confessed. "You were right," I said. She tilted her head. "About what?" People did not need instructions first. They needed confidence. She looked genuinely pleased but never smug. "And your discussion afterward gave them the language to explain what they created. We both brought something important." Her answer lingered in my mind because it reflected something I had forgotten during my marriage. Partnership was never about one person being right. It was about helping each other become better. As we carried empty coffee cups back inside, an older woman stopped us near the entrance. She held a watercolor landscape with trembling hands. "I have not painted since 1978, she said with watery eyes. "Today reminded me that I still can." After she walked away, neither Claire nor I spoke for several seconds. We simply watched participants smiling at one another, strangers becoming comfortable enough to share pieces of themselves. Claire finally broke the silence. "This," she said softly, "is why I never stopped teaching." I looked at the room filled with quiet hope, then back at her. Somewhere between lesson plans, watercolor paper, and ordinary conversations, I had begun looking forward not only to the workshops, but to every unexpected moment they allowed us to share, and that realization felt both comforting and strangely unfamiliar. The second workshop was only 4 days away, and our planning meetings gradually became the most anticipated part of my week. Every afternoon after classes ended, I found myself walking toward the art studio almost automatically, carrying another stack of notes that usually became far less important once Claire started asking unexpected questions. That Wednesday the school was nearly empty, the hallways quiet except for the distant sound of a janitor's vacuum and the occasional echo of lockers closing. When I reached the studio, I found Claire sitting on the floor surrounded by dozens of photographs collected from local museums, libraries, and neighborhood families. She looked up with an excited smile. "Perfect timing," she said. "I need another opinion." I set my bag down beside her and joined her on the polished wooden floor. She spread several photographs across the space between us. Some showed children learning to paint. Others captured grandparents reading to grandchildren, old storefronts, family picnics, and community celebrations from decades earlier. "I want everyone to choose one photograph," she explained, "and tell the story they imagine behind it." I studied the collection carefully. "There is no correct answer." "Exactly," she replied. "Sometimes imagination reveals truths that facts never can." We spent nearly an hour sorting images into different themes, occasionally disagreeing but never arguing. Our conversations had begun to flow with surprising ease. One idea naturally led to another until neither of us remembered who had suggested what first. At some point my stomach let out an unmistakable growl. Claire laughed so hard she nearly dropped the photographs. "Professor Prepared forgot lunch?" she teased. I checked my watch and blinked in disbelief. It was already almost 6 o'clock. Apparently, I forgot the entire afternoon. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out 2 containers. Good thing I planned ahead. Inside were homemade vegetable soup and slices of warm sourdough bread wrapped in a clean kitchen towel. "You cooked this?" I asked. "Last night," she answered with a shrug. My grandmother believed nobody should solve problems on an empty stomach. We ate together at one of the classroom tables while rain began tapping softly against the windows. The soup was simple, comforting, and somehow tasted exactly like the kind of evening I had not experienced in years. There was no pressure to impress anyone, no careful choice of words, only easy conversation drifting between stories about childhood teachers, favorite books, embarrassing first jobs, and places we still hope to visit someday. I learned that Claire had once considered becoming an architect before realizing that helping people discover creativity mattered more than designing buildings. She learned that I had secretly written short stories in college, but had stopped after convincing myself they were never good enough. She looked at me with genuine surprise. "Do you still have them?" I smiled faintly. "Probably somewhere in a dusty box." "Then one day we are going to find that box." I laughed quietly. "You make everything sound possible." She rested her chin lightly against her hand. "Maybe it already is. Sometimes people just need someone else to believe in them first." Her words settled gently into the silence that followed. Outside, the rain continued falling in slow, steady rhythms while the classroom lights reflected against the dark windows, making the room feel like a small island separated from the rest of the world. As we packed away the photographs, I realized I had spent an entire evening without thinking about my divorce even once. Instead, I drove home carrying the warmth of homemade soup, unfinished conversations, and the unfamiliar comfort of knowing that tomorrow I would see Claire again, and for reasons I was only beginning to understand. That simple thought made the road ahead seem brighter than it had in a very long time. The following Saturday arrived wrapped in a pale blue sky that promised one of those rare autumn afternoons when the air felt cool, but the sunlight still carried a gentle warmth. By now, our community workshops had developed their own rhythm. People no longer entered quietly with uncertain smiles. They greeted one another by name, exchanged stories before class, and filled the room with the comfortable energy of people who no longer felt like strangers. Watching that transformation became my favorite part of every session. Claire was already moving from table to table before we officially began, asking about grandchildren, recent vacations, favorite books, and unfinished paintings. She remembered details that most people would have forgotten, and every conversation left someone smiling. I wondered if she realized how extraordinary that gift truly was. The activity that afternoon centered on unfinished dreams. Each participant received a blank journal page with a single question printed across the top. What have you always wanted to try, but never believed you could? The room grew unusually quiet as people stared at the words. Some smiled. Others hesitated. A few simply held their pencils without writing anything at all. I walked slowly among the tables, answering questions whenever someone looked uncertain, while Claire knelt beside an elderly gentleman who admitted he had always wanted to learn watercolor painting but believed he had started too late. There is no expiration date on curiosity, she told him gently. The only thing that grows old is regret. I caught myself smiling before I even realized it. Later that afternoon, as participants worked independently, Claire handed me a folded piece of paper. Your assignment, she whispered with a playful grin. I unfolded it and found the same question everyone else had received. That hardly seems fair, I said quietly. Teachers usually do not have homework. Today they do. I looked down at the empty page. For several moments, I could not think of a single answer. Then, almost without thinking, I wrote 3 simple words. Write my novel. I stared at the sentence longer than I expected. Claire never asked to read it. She simply folded her own paper and slipped it into her notebook. Keep it, she said softly. Sometimes goals become more real after we admit them to ourselves. When the workshop ended, we stayed behind to clean the room as we always did. Chairs scraped gently across the wooden floor while the late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, turning floating dust into tiny flecks of gold. We packed paintbrushes into storage bins, stacked journals, and gathered forgotten coffee cups. Reaching for the same storage box at exactly the same moment, our hands met again. This time neither of us pulled away immediately. It lasted only a heartbeat before we both smiled and continued lifting the box together. Nothing remarkable had happened. It was only a shared task completed by 2 colleagues. Yet the quiet warmth of that brief moment lingered far longer than logic suggested it should. As we carried supplies toward the storage closet, Claire glanced at me with thoughtful eyes. You smiled more today than you did during our first meeting. I laughed softly. You counted. Not exactly, she answered. I just noticed. The simplicity of those words followed me all the way home. For years I had lived beside someone who rarely noticed the small changes in me, yet Claire seemed to recognize them without even trying. That evening I placed the folded journal page inside the top drawer of my desk instead of throwing it away. Before turning off the light, I looked at those 3 handwritten words one more time. For the first time in many years, they no longer felt like something impossible. They felt like the beginning of a promise I might actually keep. A week later, Claire surprised me with an invitation that sounded so simple I almost said no before she finished asking. There is a botanical garden about 20 minutes from here, she said while we packed away supplies after school. The fall exhibit opens this weekend, and I thought it might inspire ideas for our next workshop. No lesson plans.
No meetings.
Just looking. I hesitated for a moment, not because I disliked the idea, but because I had spent so many years believing every hour needed a practical purpose. She must have noticed the uncertainty in my expression because she smiled gently. You are allowed to enjoy something without grading it afterward. I laughed quietly. That sounds suspiciously like another lesson. Maybe, she replied. Or maybe it is just a walk. Saturday morning greeted us with crisp air and a cloudless sky. The trees surrounding the gardens had turned brilliant shades of gold, orange, and deep crimson, and every pathway seemed covered with leaves that crunched softly beneath our shoes. Families wandered between flower beds while children chased butterflies that refused to accept summer was over. Claire carried a small sketchbook tucked beneath her arm, while I held a paper cup filled with cinnamon coffee that warmed my hands against the cool breeze. We wandered slowly through rows of late-blooming chrysanthemums, ornamental grasses, and quiet ponds that reflected the changing colors like watercolor paintings. Claire stopped often, not because she wanted to draw every flower, but because she noticed details I would have walked past without a second glance. She pointed out the delicate patterns on a single maple leaf, the way sunlight filtered through branches, and the tiny ripples spreading across a pond after one leaf gently landed on the surface. Most people think inspiration arrives in dramatic moments, she said. I think it usually whispers. I looked around at the peaceful landscape. Maybe I have been listening for the wrong kind of voice. She smiled without answering. A few minutes later, we reached a small wooden bridge overlooking a quiet stream. An elderly man sat nearby, painting the scenery on a portable easel. His hands moved slowly but confidently, adding careful strokes of color, while his wife read beside him on a nearby bench. Claire watched them with obvious admiration. Goals, she whispered.
I glänzt så her.
Growing old, while still creating? She nodded, and still making time to sit beside someone who understands why creating matters. Her words settled gently between us, carried away by the breeze before either of us added anything else. We continued walking until we found a secluded bench beneath an enormous oak tree. Claire opened her sketchbook and handed me a pencil. Draw something. I immediately shook my head. You know I cannot. That is exactly why you should. I stared at the blank page, feeling strangely nervous over something so insignificant. Finally, I sketched the outline of the old oak tree in front of us. The proportions were uneven, the branches awkward, and the perspective was far from perfect. I started apologizing before I even finished. Claire studied the drawing with complete seriousness. Do you know what I like about it? She asked. Everything that is wrong with it? She laughed softly.
No.
I like that you actually finished it instead of giving up halfway. I looked at the page again. She was right. Years ago, I would have crumpled it into a ball because it was imperfect. Instead, I quietly closed the sketchbook and handed it back. As we left the gardens that afternoon, I realized the most meaningful part of the day had not been the flowers, the artwork, or even the conversations. It was the unfamiliar feeling of being completely myself without worrying whether that version of me was enough. Somehow, without ever saying the words directly, Claire had begun teaching me that confidence was not something earned after perfection. It was something practiced long before perfection ever arrived. The weather shifted without warning 3 days later. A steady rain settled over the city before sunrise, leaving the school wrapped in a quiet gray haze that blurred every window and softened every sound. Classes ended early because several after-school activities had been canceled, but Claire and I still planned to prepare materials for the final weeks of our community program. By the time I reached the art studio, the rain had become heavier, drumming gently against the roof, while cool air slipped through the old window frames. Claire stood near the coffee maker, holding 2 steaming mugs. She handed one to me, without asking how I liked it. Somehow she already knew. Long day, she asked. I smiled into the warm cup. Not as long as it felt yesterday. She laughed softly. That sounds like something a literature teacher would say. We spent the next hour organizing journals, reviewing participant feedback, and planning the closing exhibition where everyone would display their work. Outside, the rain continued falling in slow, patient rhythms that made the room feel separated from the rest of the world. At one point, the lights flickered for a second before settling again, and we both looked up instinctively. Old building, Claire said with a shrug. It likes reminding us it has character. I found myself laughing more easily than I would have imagined only a few months earlier. When we finally finished sorting the last stack of papers, neither of us seemed in a hurry to leave. Claire sat on one of the classroom stools, turning an unused paintbrush slowly between her fingers. Can I ask you something? She said. Of course. She looked at me with the same thoughtful expression she always wore before asking an important question. When was the last time you chose something only because it made you happy? The answer should have come quickly. Instead, silence settled between us. I searched through years of memories and realized almost every decision I had made had been based on responsibility, practicality, or someone else's expectations. My marriage, my schedule, my routines. Even the hobbies I abandoned had quietly disappeared because they no longer fit someone else's plans. I lowered my eyes toward the coffee cup warming my hands. I honestly cannot remember, I admitted. The confession surprised even me. Claire did not interrupt or rush to fill the silence.
She
simply waited. Something about that patience made the words continue on their own. I spent so many years trying to become the person everyone needed that I stopped asking who I wanted to be. Every choice felt like another obligation. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that was what adulthood looked like. My voice remained calm, but I felt an unexpected weight lifting with every sentence. When my marriage ended, I realized I did not actually know the woman living in my own house anymore. Claire's eyes never left mine. There was no pity in them, only quiet understanding. "I think," she said gently, "the fact that you can say that out loud means you have already started finding her again." I looked toward the rain streaking across the windows. The room remained silent except for the soft tapping outside and the distant hum of the heating system. For the first time, sharing that truth did not make me feel embarrassed. It made me feel lighter. Claire reached into her notebook and carefully tore out a blank sheet of paper before sliding it across the table. "Then let us start with one question," she said with a warm smile. "Who is Evelyn when nobody else gets to answer for her?" I stared at the empty page for several seconds before picking up my pen. I did not know the full answer yet, but for the first time in years, discovering it felt less frightening than exciting, and somehow I knew I would not have begun asking that question if Claire had never quietly walked into my life. The question Claire had written on that blank sheet refused to leave my mind. Who is Evelyn when nobody else gets to answer for her? I carried it home, placed it beside my bed, and somehow found myself reading it every evening before turning off the light. Days passed, yet the page remained mostly empty. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had spent so much of my life becoming who others expected that choosing my own answer felt strangely unfamiliar. The community program continued to flourish, and our final exhibition slowly began taking shape. Every workshop brought new stories, new paintings, and new moments that reminded me how much people could change when someone believed in them. I noticed the same change happening inside myself, but that realization also carried an unexpected fear. One afternoon, while hanging artwork in the auditorium, another teacher stopped beside me and smiled. "You and Claire make a great team," she said. "She brings the excitement and you bring the calm." I thanked her politely, but after she walked away, I stood still for a long moment. The comment should have felt harmless. Instead, it stirred something I had been trying not to examine too closely. Claire was 15 years younger than I was. She seemed fearless where I had become cautious, spontaneous where I relied on plans, optimistic where experience had taught me restraint. The differences that had once fascinated me suddenly felt impossible to ignore. That evening, while driving home beneath streets lined with glowing autumn leaves, I caught myself wondering what other people saw whenever we walked into a room together. Did they simply see two educators working on a project? Or did they notice the quiet happiness I could no longer pretend was not growing every time she smiled at me? The questions followed me through the weekend. By Monday, I had become quieter than usual. Claire noticed immediately. While we arranged display boards in the gymnasium, she glanced toward me with gentle concern. "You have been somewhere else all morning," she said. "Did something happen?" I forced a small smile. "Just thinking." "Those are usually the most complicated days," she replied with a soft laugh. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to admit that I had started looking forward to every conversation, every shared cup of coffee, every ordinary afternoon spent planning lessons together. Instead, I changed the subject and asked about the exhibition schedule. She answered without pressing further, but I could tell she recognized the distance I had created. Later that afternoon, after everyone else had left, I remained alone in the auditorium adjusting framed artwork that did not actually need adjusting. I told myself I was protecting the friendship we had built. I told myself that people my age should know better than to misunderstand kindness. I told myself that admiration could easily be mistaken for something deeper after a difficult chapter in life. Yet none of those explanations felt completely honest. As I switched off the lights and prepared to leave, I noticed one small watercolor hanging near the entrance. It had been painted by the elderly gentleman who once believed he was too old to begin again. Beneath the landscape, he had carefully written a single sentence in neat blue letters. "It is never too late to grow toward the light." I stood there reading those words over and over until the hallway outside fell completely silent. For reasons I could not fully explain, they stayed with me all the way home, quietly challenging every fear I had been trying so hard to defend. The final exhibition was less than a week away, and the entire school seemed to buzz with quiet anticipation. Hallways filled with framed paintings waiting to be displayed, handwritten reflections waiting to be mounted, and volunteers moving from room to room carrying supplies. Normally, I would have found comfort in the familiar rhythm of preparation, but my thoughts had become tangled in questions I could not easily untangle. Since the afternoon I stood staring at that watercolor with its simple message about growing toward the light, I had begun keeping an invisible distance between Claire and me. I arrived a little later than usual, left a little earlier, and buried myself in administrative details that could easily have been shared. I convinced myself I was protecting something important, even if I could not clearly explain what that was. Claire never complained, but I noticed the way she occasionally looked at me as though she sensed a conversation I was refusing to have. On Thursday afternoon, we met with a local newspaper reporter who wanted to feature the community project. The interview took place in the auditorium while participants arranged their artwork around us. Claire answered questions with the same warmth she always carried, giving generous credit to every volunteer, every student, and every teacher involved. At one point, the reporter smiled and asked, "What has been the most rewarding part of this experience?" Claire glanced across the room, and for one impossible second I thought she was looking directly at me. Instead, she turned toward a young volunteer named Megan, who had spent weeks helping participants frame their artwork. "Watching people surprise themselves," Claire answered. "Megan has been incredible. She believed in this project from the very beginning." Megan smiled shyly and thanked her, and the interview continued without another thought. Yet something inside me quietly sank. The feeling surprised me with its intensity. I spent the rest of the afternoon convincing myself that I was being unreasonable. Of course, Claire appreciated Megan. She deserved appreciation. Of course, Claire smiled at other people. She smiled at everyone. Still, a quiet voice inside me whispered that perhaps I had misunderstood everything from the beginning. Maybe I had mistaken kindness for closeness simply because I had been lonely for so long. Maybe every shared conversation, every lingering afternoon, every encouraging word had meant far more to me than they ever had to her. After the interview ended, Claire walked toward me carrying a folder filled with exhibition notes. "Would you mind looking over tomorrow's schedule with me?" she asked. I hesitated just long enough for disappointment to briefly cross her face before I answered. "I actually promised my sister I would have dinner with her tonight. Maybe tomorrow." It was not entirely untrue. Hannah had mentioned dinner earlier that week, but we had not made definite plans. Claire nodded politely. "Of course. Tomorrow works." She smiled, but this time it seemed smaller somehow. As I walked toward the parking lot, the evening air felt colder than it had that morning. I looked back once through the glass entrance doors and saw Claire standing alone beside the display tables, carefully straightening a frame that was already perfectly aligned. Something about that simple image settled heavily in my chest. Driving home beneath the fading orange sky, I realized distance was not making my feelings disappear. It was only replacing warmth with regret. For the first time since we met, I wondered whether protecting my heart might actually be the very thing preventing it from finding the place where it truly belonged. Friday arrived with brilliant sunshine that seemed almost unfair after so many gray afternoons. The exhibition would open the following morning, and volunteers filled every corner of the auditorium, placing labels beside paintings, arranging chairs, and adjusting lights one final time. I arrived early hoping to quietly finish the schedule Claire had wanted to review the night before. I found her standing alone near the entrance, carefully pinning participant name cards onto a welcome board. She looked up when she heard my footsteps. Her smile appeared, but this time it carried a softness that reminded me how much my recent distance must have confused her.
"Good morning," she said.
"Good morning." For a brief moment, neither of us moved. The familiar ease that had once filled every conversation seemed hidden beneath words neither of us had spoken. I finally held up the completed schedule. I finished looking everything over. Everything should run smoothly tomorrow. She accepted the folder with a grateful nod. "Thank you." Her voice remained warm, yet quieter than usual. We worked side by side for nearly an hour, hanging signs, testing microphones, and straightening display tables. Every so often our eyes met, followed by polite smiles that ended too quickly. I realized how much I missed our effortless conversations, and how completely I had been responsible for their disappearance. Around noon, the last volunteer left for lunch, leaving only the two of us inside the peaceful auditorium. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, stretching long golden rectangles across the polished floor. Claire walked toward one of the participant displays and stopped in front of the watercolor painted by the elderly gentleman who believed he had started too late. "He's going to be so proud tomorrow," she said softly. "He already should be," I answered. She nodded without looking away from the painting. "Can I ask you something?" My heart immediately tightened. "Of course." She turned toward me with a calm honesty I had come to recognize so well. "Did I do something that made you pull away?" The question landed with quiet precision because it came without accusation, only concern. I opened my mouth, but no answer arrived. Claire waited patiently, just as she always had whenever I struggled to find the right words. Finally, I looked down at my hands. "No," I admitted. "You did not do anything wrong." Then what happened? I took a slow breath, realizing there was no safe way to explain only half of the truth. "I became afraid," I said quietly. "Afraid of what?" I looked up and met her eyes. Of misunderstanding what this friendship meant. Of reading too much into every conversation. Of forgetting that we are in different places in life. The room fell completely silent except for the faint hum of the ventilation system. Claire took one slow step closer, not enough to invade my space, only enough to let me know she was still there. "Evelyn," she said gently, "do you know what confused me these past 2 weeks?" I shook my head. I kept wondering why the person I looked forward to seeing every day suddenly started disappearing. My heart skipped before I could stop it. She smiled with quiet vulnerability that I had never seen before. "The truth is, I've been trying very hard not to make you uncomfortable because I care about you more than I probably should." I stared at her, certain I had misunderstood. She continued before I could interrupt. "I admire your kindness. I admire the way you listen to people. I admire the way you quietly make every room feel safer." Somewhere between lesson plans, shared coffee, and ordinary afternoons, those feelings became something much deeper. I never expected that to happen, and I never wanted you to feel pressured by it. But pretending they do not exist has become much harder than telling you the truth. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. The sunlight, the paintings, the empty chairs, and the quiet auditorium all seemed to disappear until only her words remained. Every fear I had carefully built suddenly met one simple realization. I had not been imagining the connection between us. We had simply been protecting each other at exactly the same time. For a moment, I could not find my voice. Every careful excuse I had built over the past several weeks dissolved beneath Claire's quiet honesty, leaving only the truth I had been too frightened to acknowledge. I searched her expression for uncertainty, but instead I found patience, the same steady kindness that had slowly rebuilt parts of me I had believed were gone forever. I let out a nervous laugh that sounded almost unfamiliar. "I spent so much time convincing myself I imagined all of this," I admitted. "I kept telling myself you were simply kind to everyone." Claire smiled gently. "I am kind to everyone." She paused before adding, "But I look forward to seeing only one person every morning." The words settled into the silence between us with remarkable softness. I felt tears gathering unexpectedly, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally putting down a weight I had carried alone. "I was afraid," I whispered. "Not because of you. Because of me." I kept thinking about the difference in our ages, about what people might assume, about whether I was confusing gratitude with something deeper after everything that happened in my marriage. Claire listened without interrupting. When I finished, she stepped a little closer, still leaving enough space for me to choose what happened next. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" she asked quietly. I shook my head. "I see someone who makes people feel heard." I see someone whose students trust her because she never pretends to know all the answers. I see someone who stayed compassionate even after disappointment could have made her cynical. I have never counted the years between us because none of those things have anything to do with age. I felt my shoulders relax as though I had finally been given permission to stop carrying every expectation that had shaped my life for so long. I smiled through the tears that still lingered in my eyes. You always know exactly what to say. Claire laughed softly. Not always. I have rehearsed this conversation in my head at least 20 times. That confession made both of us laugh, and the remaining tension quietly disappeared. Outside the tall auditorium windows, bright afternoon sunlight illuminated, the last orange leaves still clinging to the maple trees, while inside the room the artwork created by dozens of ordinary people surrounded us with stories of courage, hope, and second chances. I glanced toward the watercolor painted by the elderly gentleman whose message had stayed with me for days. It is never too late to grow toward the light. I looked back at Claire and realized that every workshop, every conversation, every shared cup of coffee had been guiding me toward this very moment. I do not want to spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if fear had made every decision for me, I said quietly. Neither do I, Claire answered. I reached for her hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if she wished. Instead, her fingers gently met mine, warm and steady, carrying the same quiet reassurance they had offered from the very beginning. We stood there smiling at one another without rushing to say anything else. There was no dramatic declaration, no audience, no perfect soundtrack, only two women who had finally stopped hiding behind uncertainty. In that peaceful silence, I understood something that had taken me years to learn. Real courage was not the absence of fear. It was choosing honesty even while fear was still standing beside you, and for the first time in a very long while, choosing honesty felt exactly like choosing home. The exhibition opened the next morning beneath clear November skies, and by 9 o'clock the auditorium had filled with families, neighbors, teachers, former students, and community members eager to celebrate the work created over the past several months. Laughter drifted through the room as people paused before paintings, handwritten reflections, and photographs that captured not only artistic progress, but personal transformation. I stood near the entrance greeting visitors, and every few moments someone stopped to thank us for creating a place where they had finally felt brave enough to try something new. Their words reminded me that the greatest changes had rarely happened because of talent. They had happened because someone believed they belonged. Claire moved effortlessly through the crowd, congratulating every participant before they could congratulate her. She celebrated each small victory with genuine joy, never drawing attention to herself, and watching her reminded me of something I had once forgotten. The people who leave the deepest mark on our lives are often the ones who quietly help us recognize the strength we already possess. Near the center of the room, the elderly gentleman proudly stood beside the watercolor landscape he had almost never painted. His wife reached for his hand as visitors admired his work, and when he noticed us approaching, his eyes filled with grateful emotion. "You too changed more than my painting," he said softly. "You reminded me that there are still new chapters waiting, no matter how old the book becomes." I smiled, recognizing that his words belonged to all of us. Throughout the afternoon, participants shared stories about dreams they planned to pursue, classes they wanted to take, and hobbies they intended to rediscover. One woman enrolled in a creative writing course after 30 years away from school. Another planned to open a small neighborhood art group. Listening to them, I realized our project had never really been about art. It had always been about permission. Permission to begin again. Permission to fail without shame. Permission to hope. As the last guests slowly made their way toward the exit, the auditorium grew quiet once more. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, bathing the room in the same warm golden light that had welcomed us so many afternoons before. Claire and I remained behind, gathering forgotten programs and folding empty chairs exactly as we had done after every workshop, but everything felt different now. Not because the room had changed, but because we had. She glanced toward me with the familiar smile that had first caught me completely by surprise weeks earlier. "So," she asked, What happens after the final lesson? I looked around the peaceful room before answering. Maybe it is not the final one. The following spring, we launched a weekend community arts and literature program together, welcoming anyone who believed they had waited too long to discover something new about themselves. Every Saturday morning, the classrooms filled with people carrying sketchbooks, journals, hopeful conversations, and second chances. Sometimes I taught writing while Claire guided painting. Sometimes we switched simply because curiosity mattered more than routine. On the wall near the entrance, framed in simple oak, hung a handwritten sentence that every visitor passed before entering. It read, "It is never too late to grow toward the light." I still kept the blank page Claire had given me months earlier, the one asking who Evelyn was when nobody else got to answer for her. Today it was no longer blank. It contained stories, dreams, plans, and one quiet truth written across the bottom in steady handwriting. The most important lessons are never found inside textbooks. They are discovered in ordinary moments, shared with extraordinary people, when we finally find the courage to become ourselves.